Turn in your Bibles to the book of Matthew. The title for this message is On the Clock. And one of the things that encourages me most about this church and its members, the members that I grew up with and the new members, are the way that you guys dedicate yourselves to the people here. So this Sunday afternoon, there were plenty of you out at various nursing homes teaching, singing, playing various instruments all around town. I think of all the time that's spent here on children's ministries. I see people meeting in the conference room just before this sermon and talking about Boys of Faith. I know people plan plenty of activities outside of Sunday as well. We help each other move, tear down each other's roofs, host meals, Bible studies, and a whole lot more. Even the amount of random house calls that I've been able to benefit from just from variously skilled people around here is tremendous. Our people are constantly serving God by serving each other, this church, and in many other ways. And I really can't get enough of the people here, and it's evidently clear that you can't get enough of each other. But there is a lot to do, and sometimes it feels like there might be not enough people to do it, not enough time to do it. And that can bring about questions about how we're spending each other's time. That can also bring about fatigue. In school, is taught about the principle called the Pareto principle, and it states that 20% of the people in an organization do 80% of the work. And hearing that might motivate some of you, or it might discourage you. You might be thinking, I can't believe only 20% of us do 80% of the work. Or on the other hand, you're thinking, only 20% of us do the work. Time to get to work. So maybe you have caught yourself looking around and wondering where everyone else is, or you've considered taking a step back from various ways you serve others and don't plan on recommitting to anything else, at least anytime soon. I've put in a lot of work. I've been taking care of this individual for 10 years. I've been a volunteer in this way for long enough. I've done plenty. I deserve to step back and take a break. And that word deserve is a pretty popular cultural term, very popular marketing term. You deserve a vacation, you deserve to be happy, you deserve the best. I'm recently getting ads about how I deserve the best internet. Sunday afternoon is my time to take a nap. Or maybe, I just got off work, you expect me to do more? Aren't there plenty of other people who could help with that? I had plans to spend on me, some me time. But what we'll look at is if Christ had this self-serving attitude. And what we'll find is that there's absolutely no time for it. If you're a believer, you don't have time to waste on self-centered pursuits in place of God's. Once you're saved, if you're still breathing, it is so you can serve and be used by God. 1 John 2:6 says, "The one who says he abides in him ought himself to walk in the same manner as he walked." So let's take a look at how he walked and how he spent his time. And tonight we'll use Christ as a model for how we're to spend our lives, our energy, our time, our finances, and anything else that we can manage to give. So that the next time we think we deserve a little me time, we can take a moment to think twice. And instead, we can think about what Jesus spent his time doing. And just as a preview, it is back-to-back-to-back ministry for his Father and the people around him. Our outline will be time spent on others, time spent on self, and why. So first off, time spent on others. And if we wanted to kick things off with Christ, we could start when he's just 12 years old in Luke 2, being about his Father's business already, or being in his Father's house. But for our purposes, we're going to start with his adult ministry. Turn to Matthew chapter 5. We'll really pick things up in Matthew chapter 8, and it'll be just after the ultimate sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And in it, he talks about this abuse that you and I are to endure for his glory. And what I'd like us to think about as we read through some parts of Matthew 5 is just how inconvenient and selfless these examples are. Matthew chapter 5, start in verse 39. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. Doesn't really sound like what somebody would deserve. Or verse 40, if anyone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your garment also. You think this is pretty unfair treatment, let alone suing somebody over a tunic. Verse 41, and whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. And this isn't the attitude that we think about when we think about what we deserve. The context for this passage is loving your enemies, and sandwiched between do not resist an evil person in verse 39 and love your enemies in verse 44, we have this command to allow this abuse from whoever and anyone. So if we have these extreme scenarios of permitting someone to beat us, giving up of our clothing, doubling the distance traveled, and giving up your money, how much more is there to give before things get to that point? Don't you think it's probably expected that we should be willing to give up of an evening or a Sunday afternoon for somebody else, let alone take a beating from them? And what's the attitude when it seems like our valuable time is not taken into consideration by those asking to borrow some of it? Now think about the angst you might feel when you return home after work, detasseling, or school, immediately have to clock into the other job or the other responsibilities that are just waiting for you. I work from home, and the moment I flick off the lights in my office, my 6-year-old is waiting around the corner, and it is time to play. For the 4th of July, he said, it's a holiday, that means you have to play with us. And here we have Christ in one of his first ever sermons preaching about laying yourself aside for somebody else. So let's get into it and see how long it takes for Christ to preach and then put into practice what he preaches. Go to Matthew chapter 7. We'll start in verse 28 and we'll get into chapter 8, verse 1 and continuing. Matthew 7, verse 28 says, Now it happened that when Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. Chapter 8, verse 1 says that when Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him, and behold, a leper came to him and was bowing down before him, and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. So back in Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, news spreads of Jesus throughout all Syria, and Jesus is healing and preaching and healing. And these massive crowds just start to follow him. So he and his disciples, they pack it up, go up a mountain, and start to teach from there. And this will kick off the pattern that we're going to focus on. Jesus is never recorded avoiding his God-given tasks so that he can accomplish his own self-interests. He's going to have his own plans, but they're going to be disrupted plenty of times. Instead, people are going to take advantage of him every single moment they get. And just when he finishes one task, one healing, one miracle, or one sermon, it is immediately on to the next. I was thinking about how, back in 2020, how spent healthcare workers were. You'd see headlines about how there's just this mass exodus of nurses and other medical professionals just because of how exhausting it had become. Just the lack of consideration and support from people and just the tremendous task it was to keep up with everything. Or if you've ever worked in any sort of service or people-oriented industry, you know how draining exhausting people can be. They can drag you down. Being around people, period, even perfectly pleasant people, especially for you introverts, can be exhausting. Sure, dealing with people's health care and other personal needs is exhausting, but that cannot be anything close compared to what Christ lives his life like. By the end of Christ's ministry, some people argue that there wasn't a single ill person left in the entire nation of Israel, and I would be inclined to believe that. But that is a lot of hard work. So, Christ, just having finished healing and then preaching, gets right back into the same thing. Once he's made it down the mountain with large crowds following, a leper needs healing. And it'd be accepted among most of us if Matthew read, but Jesus, being tired and weary, sent the leper off to come back tomorrow. Sorry, we're closed. You can't blame him. He's been working hard, he needs a break, he just finished a sermon. But Christ's life is not lived that way. He's not one to look out for himself the way that we're so often encouraged to make sure that you look after me first, put the gas mask or oxygen mask on yourself first. Instead, he heals the leper in 8 verse 3, and then turns around and also heals a centurion's paralyzed servant in verse 5. Pick up in verse 5 of chapter 8. It says, "When Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, 'Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented.'" And we know from this story, what happens next. Jesus, he agrees. Says, "Yeah, I'll come over. Let's take care of your servant." And the centurion stops him. He says, "Nope, I believe that you can heal him from right where you stand." And Jesus is blown away by his faith, compares it to like no one else and the entire nation of Israel. And Jesus does it. He heals them right there on the spot. And good thing too, because that makes more time for Jesus to move on to the next thing. 8 verse 14. When Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. And he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began waiting on him. So now, maybe we're thinking, it's finally time to relax. It's 5 o'clock, and that means, as far as we're concerned, that's time to pack it up, move on with the rest of our day. Our responsibilities are complete as far as work is concerned, and go about our lives. But in verse 16, "Now when evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were ill." You might be thinking, I got to my disciples' house, his mother-in-law is now healed, she's even waiting on me, it's time to just relax. But now there's a line of people, and they all need healing, and he healed all. By all accounts, Jesus has finished a hard day's work. No one would have had anything negative to say about him if he's truly said, guys, I'm tired, and I'd like to turn it in for the night. You'd think, fine, we know where he lives, or at least for this night, and we'll come back tomorrow. It's like us applauding ourselves for the productive day that we've had. Maybe it's Saturday, and you've finished cleaning, mowing the lawn, homework is caught up, and you fixed the thing that's been broken for weeks. And you might think to yourself or say to your spouse, what a productive day. And that, at least for me, usually means I can table all the other productive things I was going to do because of how productive I've already been, and maybe a reward to follow. Maybe some food, sitting down to relax, watching TV, taking a nap. I'm looking forward to all of those things immediately after this in exactly that order. And I'm thankful to God for those things. But I'd like us to keep this in perspective. What does 5 o'clock look like for Christ? When I'm tired, when I'm ready to do what I want to do, let's think, what would Christ do? What was his life like at 5 o'clock, figuratively speaking? He's brought many, it says, who had unclean spirits, and he heals them all. Every single last one. I used to work a job where we'd close at 6, and at 5:59 we are at the door ready to switch the latch. No one else is coming in. The lights are turning off, the building is locked. I am not paid to be here any longer, and I'm going to leave. Or maybe you've been through a drive-through late at night, getting closing time, and you watch that employee come out and sever the line and say, sorry, we're closing soon, we can't serve anybody. There's just not enough time to get to everyone, things shut down. But could you imagine if Peter, or likely Judas, went to the back of the line and said, sorry, we have to stop things here. Jesus, he's a busy guy, and you guys can come back later. No. Jesus, it says, takes time to heal them all. And when all the work is done, when all the responsibilities are finally caught up, what do we like to do at the end of our day? When you've been gone for a while, whether it's a day trip or several days, it's just nice to look forward to coming back home. We were at high school camp for a few days, and for 5 days straight, I'd wake up, my feet would hit tile, then concrete, then dirt, and it would be that way every single day. And I could not believe how soft carpet was when I returned. Just these little things that I get to look forward to, things that I had never even considered looking forward to in the first place. But we have those things. What about Christ? After serving people all day and all night, where does he get to crash? We're going to start in verse 20 of chapter 8. Context here is somebody asks Jesus, says, hey, I would like to follow you. And Jesus says to him in verse 20, the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. At the end of the day, Jesus doesn't even have a home. The bird has a home. You and I have a home. And to add insult to injury, when Jesus is trying to get some sleep not at home, what happens? Verse 23, skip over a few verses, says, when Jesus got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves, but Jesus himself was sleeping. And you guys know where this goes. Verse 25, they came to him and got him up, saying, save us, Lord, we are perishing. Is Christ's mind ever on himself? I know what it's like to be woken up in the middle of sleeping. It is very unpleasant. But is Christ's mind ever on himself and what would be more convenient for him? If it's at the expense of somebody else, does he ever say, hey, I need to get some sleep, I've got a big day tomorrow? Or do you know the day I've had? I need a break. No. He finishes preaching, begins healing, preaching, healing, some more healing, and finally, when he tries to get some sleep, he gets woken up. And not by the storm, not by waves crashing over his bench, but by the people who are afraid of it. Immediately, I think of my wife and any other person who has raised young kids, and you're stretching to make it to your kid's bedtime. And when bedtime arrives, you can finally catch your breath. But what happens throughout the night? Just constant disruption. But you set yourself aside for the sake of these people that you love. It can be a drag and it's exhausting, but you have compassion for your kids in that case. Back to the boat. Be thinking, if I was on this boat, could I manage to keep up? Could I keep up with Jesus? Situation here is he's finally escaped the crowds. He's alone with his disciples. They're headed across to the other side. And it's that feeling of being untouchable. Maybe you have silenced your phone. You've been able to turn on the forward emails for work. Maybe you're going to a city or a country where nobody even knows your name. It is about to be bliss. Your boat touches land and maybe you're ready to kick back, relax. But what happens when Christ reaches shore? Verse 28, chapter 8, says, when he came to the other side, into the region of the Gadarenes, two men who were demon-possessed met him as they were coming out of the tombs. They were so extremely violent and no one could pass by that way. Mark 5:2 says that he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs came out and caused trouble. No breaks. The moment he touches land, it says immediately a demon comes running out of the tombs. And we know the story. Demons plead with Jesus and he permits them to go into the swine. And the whole city, it says, isn't too thrilled with the situation. Verse 34, and behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus when they saw him, and they pleaded with him to leave their region. Other accounts say they implored. They're not asking, they are imploring him, get out. So after Jesus, he gets a little sleep. After spending a whole day and night healing and preaching, he finally makes it across the water. I don't think he had any intentions to actually vacation here. But as soon as he arrives and casts out demons, he's told to pack it up and leave. Are you exhausted yet? Reading this, do you kind of feel like you would need to catch your breath? But this is not a person who takes time to consider what they would prefer to do. Jesus is at God's disposal, and if you and I are a child of his, a slave, so are you. Wherever God leads, he will go, all the while without grumbling or complaining. Maybe calling the disciples, you of little faith, once in a while. But Jesus didn't receive a thanks for casting out demons from these unrestrainable men. For a while, people just couldn't travel here. You'd think, dealing with this means that I can at least walk along this coast. No, it's just get out, leave. So let's quickly cover a few more events just to further illustrate the demand that Christ was the supply for. Matthew chapter 9, verse 1, it says, "Getting back into the boat, Jesus crossed over the sea and came to his own city. And behold, they brought to him a paralytic on a bed. Seeing their faith, Jesus said to the paralytic, 'Take courage, son, your sins are forgiven.'" The word behold there, it's almost going to be a running joke in the situation of Christ's schedule. Jesus is back in town. He must have had a nice trip. Now that you're back, we've got a paralytic for you. And Jesus, just a few verses later, goes on to more of the same thing. So we're going to skip over to verse 11, and we talk about being woken up in the middle of sleep and the attitude we might have. And the only other situation where I love being interrupted is during my meal. So sleep, definitely number 1. 2 would probably be during a meal. And leave it to Jesus. At mealtime, Jesus is bothered about when and who he's eating with. He can't get a moment. In verse 11 of Matthew chapter 9, the Pharisees want to know why he's eating with his new disciple Matthew and all these low-life sinners and tax collectors. Then in verse 14, John's disciples want to know why he's eating at all. Verse 14, "Then the disciples of John came to him asking, 'Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?'" Can't he eat a meal in peace? Can't I eat a meal in peace? Have you ever said that? Jesus, the only person to ever live who's truly entitled to everything, the whole world sought no entitlement at all. Not with regards to his appetite, his time, his energy, his home, lack thereof, nothing. His entire existence was to serve and please God, and that meant that his travel plans could be disrupted. It might mean you're never going to have a peaceful meal again. And his life was to be spent serving the same people who would later have him executed. Verse 18, just to continue on through this is going to be the busiest day that we're going to go over. Verse 9, or verse 18 of chapter 9 says, "While he's saying these things to them, while he's explaining why he's allowed to eat, behold," more work, "a synagogue official came and was bowing down before him and said, 'My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live.' Jesus got up and began to follow him, and so did his disciples." So dinner is interrupted, or lunch, whatever it was, about questions for why he's allowed to eat. Then dinner is cut short for a request for a miracle. Is that all? Is that all that this day is going to hold? No. "And behold, a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years, this is verse 20, came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment." Verse 21, "For she was saying to herself, 'If I only touch his garment, I will be saved from this.' But Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, 'Daughter, take courage, your faith has saved you.' At once the woman was saved from her hemorrhage." Also, just take note of the way that these words are going to be used. Son, daughter. Does Jesus sound irritated at all? No. Jesus isn't put out by these people. He's there to serve them. So to recap, Jesus has to explain why he's allowed to eat, and while that's happening, he's called to resurrect a girl from the dead. And while he's headed to that girl's house, he inadvertently heals a woman of her hemorrhage. So Christ is on the clock, and there's no clocking out until the day he dies. And if you and I are supposed to walk the same way he walked, we're on the clock too. So next time we decide to weigh all the things that our day has already held, all the things that we've already done for God in an effort to justify pulling back, remember things like this. And maybe if you find yourself neglecting or denying opportunities God is presenting you, remember how Christ handled these opportunities. He's right in the midst of going to resurrect somebody from the dead, and then adds more to his plate. Now, this isn't to say that you can't or shouldn't stop serving in one particular way, whether it's at home, church, your family, etc. But hopefully, the motivation for moving on from serving in one place isn't to make more time for yourself. And so many times it isn't. I am constantly amazed at what pulling back means here. I've been a part of plenty of ministries where I'll hear, this person, they're moving on, and it'll make me sad. And then I'll be back next week and I'll find out that they just started a Bible study, or that they just started teaching Wednesday nights. Like, they are always on the move. And that's always what I witness here. This pulling back is to make room for others. Not that you're making more room for time spent on yourself. So let's keep going in the way that Matthew records things. What happens after he resurrects a girl from the dead? Now, you'd think that's a pretty big thing to do once a day. If I did that in a day, I would be done. Jesus resurrects a girl from the dead, and then in verse 27, and as Jesus went on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." And he entered the house, and blind men came up to him, and Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I'm able to do this?" They said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes, saying, "It shall be done according to your faith." And their eyes were opened. So, hemorrhage, check. Dead girl, check. Blind men, check. God, what else do you have for me? Verse 32. As they were going out, behold, a mute, demon-possessed man was brought to him. This guy has the works. And Jesus, in the span of seemingly a few hours, we don't know the exact timeline, but it seems like as he was doing this also happened. In the span of a few hours, he's dealt with the paralyzed, the ignorant, the bleeding, the dead, the blind, and the demon-possessed. There's a busy day. In verse 35, chapter 9, Jesus was going through all the cities and the villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. After a while, you notice, Matthew stops getting into specifics. For a while there was this girl, she had this issue. There was this little girl, she had this other issue, and he's itemizing everything. After a while, though, I'd like to imagine Matthew sitting down, writing all this. I can't keep up. This is ridiculous. This is just too much. Go to John chapter 21. John ends his gospel with an explanation for why sometimes Matthew likes to summarize things. Verse 25. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which, if they were written one after another, as Matthew has been trying to do up until this point, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. There is so much that we don't know. You got a record of a few hours, and it was already a tremendous amount of work. And there's more work that we have no clue about. We just know that he was doing a lot of preaching, a lot of teaching in various cities all around. And you think, why? What does he owe these people? His own creation. Did they deserve this? What's the motivation for this grueling schedule and lifestyle? Now, why exhaust all your time and energy for these people that will want nothing to do with him in a short little while, and these same people will kill him? Why bother? Go back to Matthew, if you haven't already. Matthew 9, verse 36. Seeing the crowds, he felt compassion for them, because they were distressed and downcast like sheep without a shepherd. Why allow yourself to be woken up in the middle of the night? Why take time out of your day, your original plans, and your meals to help those around you? Compassion. And in Jesus' case, compassion for the whole world, for God so loved the world. There are plenty of other motivations recorded in the Gospels, such as obedience to God and to do his will, and these eternal rewards that Jesus and we get to look forward to. But right now, Jesus feels compassion. It says he felt compassion. But even Jesus, he runs into a problem here, and it's a classic supply and demand issue. Jesus, the Son of God, confined to his physical human body, he can't keep up. Verse 37 of Matthew says, "Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest.'" We're the workers. we have a role to play here. We have a responsibility as imitators of God, imitators of Christ, to live a life that is subject to God and his will for us. You and I do not have our own time, and we aren't entitled to prioritize our own interests. Go to Philippians chapter 2. Plenty of you probably already know where this is going. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 says, "Doing nothing from selfish ambition or vainglory, but with humility of mind, regarding one another as more important than yourselves, not merely looking out for your own personal interests, but also for the interest of others." You can turn back to Matthew. So yes, there are things that I like to do and want to do, and I can do those things, but not at the expense of what someone else needs or even just wants me to do. Do you think Jesus ever said, "No, I don't want to," in response to a plea? I have my own interests and desires, but I also need to be looking out for the interest of others and then prioritizing those interests over my own, just like Jesus did. The next thing I want to take a look at, just going through Matthew in order here, as it pertains to our commitment to serving God, is that it does not always come at the best time. Sometimes these things that are imposed upon us, asked of us, are not coming at the best time. Sometimes that's even our response. Hey, can you do this? Sorry, now is not the best time. Hey, we could really use help with the van ministry, or I see we'll need people for the nursing home ministry. Sorry, now's not a great time. Or maybe it has to do with finances, and sorry, money's tight. I'd love to help, but money's just tight right now. I've had a long day, I'd love to help, but I've already done plenty. No one knows everything that you have going on. Maybe things are complicated at home, work, friends, finances, or health. That might be the way that things are and how you feel, but how are we supposed to act? Back in Matthew, if someone forces me to go a mile, I'm supposed to go with them too. If someone asks me for something, aren't I supposed to give it to them? How did Christ act when circumstances in his own life were way less than favorable? Matthew chapter 14, skip ahead a few chapters. For context, we're going to pick up in verse 10. Matthew 14, verse 10 says, "And he, Herod, sent and had John the Baptist, beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciple came and took away the body and buried it. And they went and reported it to Jesus." So our setting here is that we have Jesus' arguably oldest friend, the person he's known since the day, before the day he was born. We just talked about this last week, how John was jumping in his mother's womb. They've known each other a while. They lived, maybe 100 miles apart. Jesus is 30. They've had a long life. I don't know how much they maybe spent time together, but they've known each other for quite a while. John was the forerunner for Christ. One of his oldest friends is suddenly dead, murdered. Is now the best time for Christ? This person that he put on a pedestal back in Matthew 11:11 as one of the greatest people, actually the greatest person to have ever been born. That is high praise coming from the Son of God. Is now the best time for him? Don't you actually imagine he's having one of the worst days of his life? Of course he is. And he even acts accordingly. Verse 13 of Matthew chapter 14 says, "When Jesus heard about John, he withdrew. He withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself." So Jesus, like when many of us experience hardship, just wanted time, just wanted some peace. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that's where the verse ended, there wouldn't be much more to discuss. We'd say that's pretty typical. I would want the same exact thing. I like Mark's account of this. Turn to Gospel of Mark, chapter 6. Same account. Verse 29 of Mark 6 says, when his disciples heard this of John the Baptist, they came and took away his body and laid it in the tomb. And the apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. This is a grueling process, a grueling schedule. Verse 32, and they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves. So Jesus and his disciples, they've been working all day. They have worked through lunch, and Jesus recognizes that it's been a tough day. He suggests that they depart to go catch their breath. They're hungry, they're exhausted, and no doubt in emotional distress just from the news of John's death. It's been a tough day. But what happens? Are people considerate of that at all? Verse 33 of Mark 6, the people saw them going, and many recognized them, and they ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. Hopefully, Jesus and his disciples, they packed some food along the way, because as soon as they arrive, work is already waiting for them. Jesus could have had time for mourning, but instead, what does he do? Verse 34 of Mark 6 says, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and again, he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and began to teach them many things. There's still work to be done. People still need him. Is anyone asking how Jesus is doing? Is anybody checking on him? See if he's hanging in there. He has virtually no regard for himself in that way. If God presents him with people and opportunities that require his attention, he puts aside his own desires for peace, for quiet, and then tends to these lost sheep. I've got plenty of people in my life that look out for me and check in on me, and I'm thankful for them, and I like to think that you do that for many people as well. But who's helping Christ carry his burden? Do any of these thousands of people take into consideration what Jesus' best interests are? No. And sometimes that's the way things go for us. Sure, sometimes people ask how things are going, but for most of the people in this room, I don't know how things are going on a daily basis. I don't understand what you go through or the trials that you're enduring. Maybe no one else is helping you with a burden. But what encourages me so much is you're still here. These people that I'm very aware of certain burdens and situations and things that they go through, and they're still here. They're still in this room. They're still serving in the kids' ministries right now and throughout all the rest of the week. We have compassion for each other as Christ has compassion for us. Go back to Matthew 14. We'll pick up where Mark left off. Matthew 14:15 says, now when it was evening, the disciples came and said to him, this place is desolate and the hour is already late. So send the crowds away that they may go into the village and buy food for themselves. So if you're familiar with the story, Christ's pouring out of himself after receiving bad news does not stop with healing and preaching. He also feeds them. He adds so much work. And the disciples, they're more like me. They're more thinking practically. The situation is, we've got thousands of people. There's a city nearby. There's nothing here. It's desolate. It's getting late. Send them into town. They can buy their own food. That is exactly what we do for these various trips that we take kids on for the high school group. We'll stop at McDonald's and everyone is buying their own meal. I'm not covering it, but maybe I should after this. This seems like a perfectly fine plan. However, following Christ's example, if you're capable of fulfilling a need, you are obligated by God to do it. Yes, there are people in town that could provide these people with food, but if you have the means, you do it. Verse 16, Jesus said to them, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. Quickly, I want to talk about how I don't want this to be a cry to be busy. There are even some of us that like to keep busy to avoid other obligations. Don't think you can get right with God by being busy. Is God pleased that you're busy for him? No. You could sign up and help in a ministry every single day of the week, and that's not what pleases God. Think of Mary and Martha. The reason we're supposed to do anything is to bring glory to God. And maybe that does come in the form of God giving you plenty of time to do things around here at the church. Maybe that means that night after night, you make a meal for your family. Maybe that means on your day off, you spend it on someone other than yourself. All of these people that we give our time, money, and energy to should have no question as to why we do it. We're not good people. We don't merely have extra time. We want to imitate Christ in the way he selflessly spent his life. And you can do that in any area of your life, like we talked about already, whether it's playing with your kids, kicking it into dad mode when you get home. You have to make dinner again. When your mom or dad need help around the house, or when your church just has a need that needs filling. You do these things with Christ's heart of compassion and an understanding that you exist on the earth to serve God, not yourself. You are his slave. In all of Christ's life, he puts the will of God and service to others above anything else. He'll cut break time short. He'll take time to teach and heal. He'll forsake the fact that his own life is sorrowful, and he'll continue to serve others. In almost every area, every aspect of his life, he neglects himself. He doesn't even have a home. No matter what's going on in his own life, he will put it aside when opportunities present themselves. But, and some of you might know where I'm going with this, does bring me to my second point, which is time spent on self. Christ does compromise this philosophy in just one way. And it isn't that Saturday is game day, and I worked hard all week and all day, and I just want a moment to watch. Or how he finally earned a night out, a vacation, or a lazy afternoon, or really any other way that we rationalize with ourselves that I can have some me time and refuse a call to serve someone else. The only part of Christ's life that he puts before me, you, and the rest of the world is his personal relationship with God. That is the only allotment of time you and I have to set aside for ourselves in place of someone else's. That's when we get to be selfish. Your relationship with God needs to be your first priority. If it's not, how are you supposed to have this heart of compassion that Jesus had? Here in Matthew 14, after John the Baptist is beheaded, after Jesus heals and feeds thousands of people to the point where, in verse 20, their hunger is completely satisfied, Jesus finally takes some time for himself. Verse 23, Matthew chapter 14 says, "And after he'd sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone." If you're a believer, most of your time should be spent doing one of two things: with God in prayer and his word, and serving others, whether that's at home, at church, wherever. Just spending that time on someone other than yourself. There's no time to prioritize me. You can have me time. I have me time, like Jesus attempted to, departing on the boat. But the moment God presents another opportunity for you to please him, you have to take it. You are a slave. The slave doesn't get to make up their own mind and choose their own path. And sometimes we don't act like we're slaves. Let's look at one other example of Christ spending time on himself. Turn to Mark chapter 1. This is Mark's account of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law, where we were in Matthew earlier. Mark 1 verse 32, take note of the time. It says, "When evening came, after the sun had set, they began bringing to him all who were ill and those who were demon-possessed." Verse 33, "The whole city had gathered at the door, and he healed many who were ill with various diseases, cast out many demons, and he was not permitting the demons to speak because they knew who he was." This is what we've read in Matthew. Then in verse 35, "And in the early morning, while it's still dark," again, the sun had set and now it's still dark, "Jesus rose up, went out of the house, and went away to a desolate place and was praying there." Verse 36, "Simon and his companions, they searched for him. They found him and said to him, 'Everyone is looking for you.' And in verse 38, he said to them, 'Let us go elsewhere to the towns nearby, so that I may preach there also. That's what I came out for. Verse 39, and he went preaching in their synagogues throughout all Galilee and casting out demons. Even Christ's personal time is considerate of others. It's still dark. He was healing people when the sun had set, and he made time for God before the sun came up again. This is a small application here, but don't use church or service to others as a way to avoid things like your family. Jesus found time for God without neglecting others. He made it a priority to spend time with God. And the moment he's wrapped up with personal time, and Peter says people need him, what does he say? Let's go. Jesus is either with God or serving others. One of the places that I think illustrates this very well is 1 Corinthians. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This may seem out of left field, I understand, but I do have a point. This is about sex. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 3 says, the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Now, what do we have here? Worldly speaking, it is the apex of self-indulgence. Why else have sex except to please myself? But Paul says it is our duty. Duty to who? Your spouse. Sex is not for you, it is for them. Now, if both of your aims are to please each other, then there's something in it for you too. But we have here what the world defiles most being described as an act of duty to the other party. That fits in with what our priorities are supposed to be. Service to others. But what takes priority over sex? This duty of service to the other. Verse 5. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer. In one sense, this is a pretty vivid picture of how much you're supposed to value your personal time with God. There's an acronym and even a song for joy. It's Jesus, others, you. And that's how our lives are supposed to be prioritized. And you have to be ready immediately to abandon one for the former. Do you treat your life this way? Do you see yourself as a tool to be used for God's purposes, or is most of your time spent fulfilling your own selfish ambitions? Jesus was wrung out dry, and then, when there's nothing left to wrung out some more. Christ knew the entire time that while he's feeding these people, healing them, preaching to them, that they would demand him to be crucified. He still did it because that's what God's will for him was. And he's not looking for rewards here. He's looking for the eternal reward. He's not concerning himself with what would make life more pleasant while he's here on earth. And that brings me to the third point, which is why. Christ maintained this lifestyle up to and beyond the day he allowed himself to be put to death. And the same people that put him to death were the people that he spent his whole life on. You and I were bought with that blood. Turn back a page or so to 1 Corinthians 6. Hopefully you're still there. 1 Corinthians 6, verse 19 says, do you not know that your body is a sanctuary of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you were bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body. You're not your own anymore. You are a sanctuary of the Holy Spirit. None of this compassion, none of these works or things would be pleasing to God without him. And because you have the Holy Spirit, you have the ability to accomplish God's will in a way that's pleasing to him. Turn to Matthew chapter 26. Just before Jesus' crucifixion, Christ finds quiet time with God to make it clear that no matter how much he dreads the cross, he will still do the will of God. Matthew chapter 26, verse 39. Says, he went a little beyond them, fell on his face, and prayed, saying, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. How much less is expected from me and you on a daily basis? Do you strive to put God's will above your own? Do you abandon your own interests in place of someone else's? Do you make time for your personal relationship with God? The time that God's given us is not our own, but His. He's given us plenty of things to do and enjoy and plenty of time to do those things. But are you ready to be displaced? Do you come across as displaced? Are you willing to be used, exploited, taken advantage of so you can imitate Christ? When someone demands 1 mile of you, are you ready to go 2? Would you give up your time, energy, and every other finite thing so that you can glorify God? Because who gave you your time, your energy, and your health, your finances in the first place? And do you make sure you're spending time with God in the midst of everything else? So one reason that we're always on the clock, so to speak, is that our time is not our own. You are slaves to righteousness. And so many of you serve God with every moment that God gives you. And I would really love to recognize every person I think of individually. But I also know that's not why you do it. When we serve God, we do it because we desire to serve God, not man. We do it in a way that our left hand does not know what our right hand is doing. We serve God because when we see an opportunity, there is a spirit-driven conviction to take that opportunity. James 4:17 says, "Therefore, to one who knows the right thing and does not do it, to him it is sin." And when we serve, it's not because, again, we're people pleasers. We're good people. Turn to Ephesians chapter 6. And we're not our own people. We're slaves. And Paul talks about slaves. Verse 5 of Ephesians chapter 6 says, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the integrity of your heart as to Christ." And here's where we get into it. Verse 6, "Not by way of eye service, as men pleasers." We're not doing things that way somebody notices and somebody's watching me. "But as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, because you want to. Serving with goodwill as to the Lord and not to men." Verse 8, "Knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free." The last why I'd like to talk about is this compassion that's been mentioned a few times. And since we're going to focus on it, let's go and review some of these places that we've talked about this compassion. Turn to Matthew chapter 15. I'll just read it for you. In Matthew 9, we talked about how Jesus, after being preaching and healing all day and all night, he saw the crowds and he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and downcast like sheep. Matthew 14:14, when we were there before, this is after Jesus hears the news of his friend John being beheaded. It says, when he went ashore, he saw the large crowd and felt compassion for them and healed their sick. And then in verse 32 of Matthew 15, we'll pick up in verse 29 since we haven't been here yet. Matthew 15, verse 29 says, "Departing from there, Jesus went along by the Sea of Galilee, and having gone up on the mountain, he was sitting there. And large crowds came to him, bringing with them those who were lame, crippled, blind, mute, and many others, and they laid them down at his feet, and he healed them. So the crowd marveled as they saw the mute speaking, the crippled restored, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel." Verse 32, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I feel compassion for the crowd, because they've remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way." Okay, who's Christ thinking about? This exorbitant list of healings that Christ went through, all these people that he restored, the blind seeing, the mute speaking, the crippled walking, who's he thinking about? Like, man, these people must be tired. That is amazing. Once again, Jesus has been the one tending to all these people for 3 days, and he still feels compelled to feed them. Verse 32, just reread this. "I feel compassion for the crowd because they've remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I don't want to send them away hungry lest they faint on the way." One more. Turn to Matthew chapter 20. Jesus does use this term of compassion in the parable of the slave who owed their Lord 10,000 talents, but we're just going to go to Matthew chapter 20. Pick up in verse 29. As they were leaving Jericho, Matthew 20:29, a large crowd followed him, and behold, 2 blind men sitting on the road, hearing that Jesus was passing by, cried out, saying, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. And let's take notice, who's doing all the work here? Jesus. Who's not doing any of the work? The crowds. Who's displaced? Verse 31, but the crowd sternly told them to be quiet, but they cried out all the more, saying, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. In verse 32, Jesus stopped and called them and said, what do you want me to do for you? They said to him, Lord, that our eyes be opened. And moved with compassion. Verse 34, and moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes, and immediately they regained their sight and followed him. So we have these examples, these 4 that we've covered, of Christ feeling compassion for these people. Matthew 9 and 14, it's when he saw the crowds. Christ sees these people that they need for him, and he feels compassion to do something about it. Matthew 15, we read, his compassion is in response to this crowd's dedication to him for 3 days. Not anything to do with the fact that he's been the one healing them this whole time. In Matthew chapter 20, his compassion is in response to the people's faith and suffering. Now, this compassion, this care and concern for others causes Jesus to completely put aside himself for others. He's still alive, and that means he's still on the clock. If God presents you with an opportunity to serve someone at the expense of your time, health, energy, or anything else, you have to take that opportunity. You're a slave. You are his slave, and you're always on the clock. No matter the cost to you, specifically you, not the cost to others, be that your spouse, your friends, your kids, your church, but no matter the cost to you. You need to take others into consideration while serving, but your circumstances shouldn't ever be part of the equation. So why? This is how Christ lived his life, and we're commanded to walk as he walked. If you're saved, you're no longer your own. You were bought with a price, and you have to use your body to glorify God. It's not to make men happy. It's not for this eye service. It's because you are a slave to Christ. You don't have a choice. And we should have a compassionate heart for people like Christ did. If this doesn't sound like the life you live, if instead your life is spent pleasing yourself, you will lose your life. Turn to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, verse 39. It says, he who has found his life will lose it. If you've been able to accomplish everything you could possibly enjoy and you waste all of your time on yourself, you've found your life. You've found it. But you will lose it. And he who has lost his life for my sake will find it. If you pour all of your energy and time into service for God, that's the life that you get to keep. If you're merely looking out for your own life, what interests you, your own comfort above following Jesus, you will lose your life. But if you give over your life, if you lose it for his sake, you will find life. You know, if you're still breathing, if you're still in the game, if you're still running the race, and you catch yourself looking at the clock, remember Christ's life. Remember all that he endured. Remember to lay aside your selfish ambitions. You know, it's a temptation to give into sin, especially the sin of selfishness, and we have the ability to resist it. I love the way Hebrews 12:4 puts it. We have not resisted yet to the point of blood. It says, look at yourself. Am I bleeding yet? No, keep going. In every area of your life, you have the opportunity to practice these things. If you've been justified, that means you are a slave to Christ and seek to serve his interests over your own. If you're saved, that means you have the Holy Spirit who gives you the ability to do these things in the first place, to have this heart of compassion for people. So at work, home, among friends and enemies, and in the church, your time can be used to glorify God. As I was writing this up, it made it so easy because of all the people here that I could think about and all the ways that, at first I'm like, oh, look how Christ did what they did. But it's actually the reverse. Look how they do what Christ did. Christ was first. Christ was our example. And there are so many people going through their own difficult times that, they seem like they couldn't be bothered by them. You still ask me about my day. Meanwhile, I know your day is going a lot more poorly than mine. But I can't even get a word in about, how are you doing? You're obsessed with my well-being and my family and how things are going. Whenever my family goes through trials, I have people here that flock to help. Even if it's not really a trial, it's just a way to help. Just a couple of weeks ago, my daughter fractured her wrist, and it may or may not have been my fault. But the next morning, I wake up and I find a gift bag for her waiting outside my door. So I get to see the way so many of you take care of your parents, your spouses, your friends, and your church every week, and it is incredibly encouraging to me. And I could talk about it a whole lot more. But that's, I know, not the point you guys do it, not the reason why. Our lives are supposed to be lived as instruments of God. Everything we think and do is to bring him glory, and it does not matter how anyone else treats us. Give up of yourself, lose your life for the glory of God. Allow yourself to be treated unfairly. You feel spent, you feel completely drained, exhausted, and you don't know what else you're supposed to do. That's exactly where you need to be, as long as that's in service to others. If your heart is still beating, then you're still on the clock, and there's still more you can give. So I want to end with saying thank you to all the encouraging people, that the way that you've lived your lives as an example for me and the other people in this church, and you got to keep doing it a little bit longer. So let's go ahead and pray. God, thank you for this body. Thank you for the example that they are to me and many others, young and old. I pray that you would give us endurance to keep running this race, to keep working as slaves to you. I pray that we'll be reminded about that when we have to do something we might not want to. That if it's for someone else, if it's for your glory, then as a slave of yours, we do not have a choice. I pray that the rest of this week goes well. I pray that we're all serving you. I pray that we're all in your word and prioritizing our personal relationship with you and our service to others before ourselves. In Christ's name, amen.